The Valdris Empire was massive, spreading across 12 different star systems with shining crystal towers on 1,000 different worlds. But right at the center of all this power, inside the Grand Palace on Siorvathus Prime, there was a secret. A secret that could destroy everything the Empire had built over centuries. Prince Kelvin was supposed to be the next emperor. He was only 8 years old by standard galactic time, but he should have been training, learning, preparing to rule. Instead, he lived completely alone. No friends. No teachers who stayed long. No family visits. Just him, sitting in a sealed chamber while the Empire wondered what would happen next. Rachel stood at the observation window, looking down at the young prince below. Her breath fogged the glass slightly as she watched him. Kelvin sat perfectly still in the exact center of his room, his body rigid like a statue. His scales should have been bright blue and purple, the royal colors that every Valdris recognized. Instead, they were a flat, lifeless gray. All 4 of his arms were wrapped tight against his body, and his silver eyes tracked patterns in the air that only he could see. Back and forth, following invisible lines. You understand what we're dealing with here? The voice beside her belonged to High Chamberlain Sortek. The tall alien scales kept changing colors, flashing orange and red. Rachel had learned that meant stress, worry, maybe even fear. In 3 cycles, the prince has to go through the bonding ceremony. He has to accept the crown of minds directly from his father's hands. Physical contact, sustained contact. If he can't handle being touched by then, everything falls apart, Rachel said quietly. She'd spent 6 weeks traveling from Earth to get here, and she'd used every moment of that journey reading files, watching videos, learning everything she could about the situation. Your empire goes to war with itself. 17 noble houses are already moving their military fleets into position. Sortek's extra set of arms trembled slightly. We've tried everything. 43 different Valdris specialists have attempted to help the prince. Touch therapists, energy healers, even mind melders who can share consciousness. Nothing worked. The prince's reaction to physical contact is extreme. When his nursemaid tried to hug him 2 years ago, he nearly died. His entire nervous system just shut down. His heart stopped for almost a minute. Rachel pressed her palm against the cool window. Down below, Kelvin had started rocking back and forth. The movement was precise, rhythmic, exactly the same motion over and over. She recognized it immediately. Her younger brother Tommy had been autistic. She'd spent 15 years of her life learning to understand his world, learning that different didn't mean broken. Why hire a human? Rachel asked. I'm nobody special. I worked in special education back on Earth. I'm not a doctor or a scientist. Because we've tried every Valdris approach that exists, Sortek said, and his voice cracked with emotion. Because human brain structure is completely different from ours. Maybe your touch won't trigger the same cascade reaction in his neural system. Maybe because your species only discovered faster-than-light travel 20 years ago, your neural signature is simpler. Less overwhelming to someone like Kelvin. Rachel didn't feel insulted. Humans were simple compared to most galactic species. No telepathy, no scales that changed color with emotion, no extra arms or sensory organs. Just basic verbal communication, facial expressions, and physical touch. Maybe simple was exactly what Kelvin needed. I'll need complete control, Rachel said firmly. No one watching through cameras, no schedule that you force him to follow, no interference from your specialists. I work at his pace on his terms. That's not negotiable. But the ceremony is in 3 cycles. That's barely 21 standard days. Then you should have called me sooner. Rachel turned to face the Chamberlain directly, meeting his multifaceted eyes without blinking. Do we have a deal or not? Sortek's scales rippled through several colors Rachel hadn't seen before. She waited. Finally, he raised his upper right arm in what she'd learned was the Valdris gesture for agreement. The prince is your responsibility now, human Rachel. Save our empire, please. Rachel looked back through the window at the small figure below. Kelvin was still rocking, still staring at invisible patterns, completely alone in a room full of expensive educational equipment he never used. Just a kid who experienced the world differently, who'd been treated like a problem to solve instead of a person to understand. I'll do my best, Rachel said softly. But I'm not here to save your empire. I'm here to help that little boy down there. If saving the empire happens along the way, that's just a bonus. The first time Rachel entered Kelvin's chamber, the brightness hit her like a physical force. Harsh white light blazed from panels all around the room, perfect for Valdris vision but absolutely overwhelming for someone with sensory issues. The air vibrated with a high-pitched hum that made her teeth ache. No wonder Kelvin looked miserable. She spent the first hour just making changes. She dimmed the lights way down until the room felt calm instead of clinical. She found the source of that awful humming sound and shut it off completely. The silence that followed felt like a blessing. Then she started removing equipment. Floating holographic displays, interactive learning modules, robotic tutors, all of it drifting around the room like technological harassment. She cleared out 17 different devices, leaving only 2. A simple geometric puzzle and a musical chime that made gentle sounds. Kelvin watched her the entire time. His silver eyes tracked her every movement, but he didn't speak, didn't move from his spot. According to the room's monitoring systems, he'd been sitting in that exact position for 3 hours before she arrived. Rachel sat down on the floor about 15 feet away from him. She deliberately didn't make eye contact. Direct eye contact could feel aggressive, threatening, especially to someone like Kelvin. Instead, she pulled out a small wooden puzzle box she'd brought from Earth. It had sliding panels and hidden compartments, nothing electronic or flashy. Just wood and clever engineering. She worked the puzzle slowly, quietly. Click, slide, click. The wooden pieces moved smoothly under her fingers. She hummed while she worked, an old song Tommy used to love. Something about the melody had always calmed him down. 1 hour passed. Then another. Rachel just kept working the puzzle, kept humming softly. No demands. No expectations. Just a calm, predictable presence. Then she heard it. The softest whisper of scales sliding across the polished floor. She kept her eyes on the puzzle, but her heart started racing. Kelvin had moved. Just 6 inches closer, but he'd moved. Rachel continued humming, continued the steady rhythm of the puzzle. Click, slide, click. Safe. Predictable. No pressure. Another hour crept by. Another 6 inches. By the time the room's artificial sun started its automatic dimming cycle for evening, Kelvin sat about 5 feet away from her. His scales had lightened slightly, no longer that dead gray. Not royal colors yet, but better. He watched her hands move through the puzzle patterns with complete focus. Rachel solved the puzzle one final time and set it down on the floor between them. Then she stood up slowly, carefully, making her movements obvious and non-threatening. She didn't walk toward Kelvin, didn't try to get closer. She just bowed in the Valdres style she'd practiced and headed for the door. Same time tomorrow, Prince Kelvin, she said gently. I'll bring different puzzles. She didn't expect any response. The file said Kelvin hadn't spoken in almost a year. But just as the door slid shut behind her, she heard it. One word, spoken in careful, practiced standard Galactic. The voice was uncertain, quiet, but absolutely clear. Tomorrow. Rachel stopped breathing for a moment. Then she kept walking, not letting her reaction show. But inside, hope bloomed like a flower. In the observation room, High Chamberlain Sortek collapsed into his chair. His scales flashed through colors that had no human equivalent, emotions too complex for simple translation. In 8 years, nobody had heard Prince Kelvin speak a single word. The human had been in the room for exactly 4 hours. And the prince had said tomorrow. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope after all. Rachel arrived at Kelvin's chamber the next morning with a bag full of puzzles and a flutter of nervous excitement in her stomach. When the door slid open, she found Kelvin already awake, sitting in the exact same spot as yesterday. But something was different. The geometric puzzle she'd left behind had been moved. It now sat precisely in the middle of the space between where she'd been sitting and where Kelvin had ended up by the end of their session. It was an invitation. Her heart soared. She sat down in her spot from yesterday, moving slowly and deliberately. Kelvin's scales flickered with the faintest hint of blue, just for a second. She'd been studying Valdres biology every night, and she knew that color meant anticipation, maybe even excitement. From her bag she pulled out 3 different puzzles from Earth. A Rubik's Cube with its colorful squares, a wire ring puzzle made of twisted metal loops, and a wooden burr puzzle that fit together like an impossible knot. Good morning, Prince Kelvin, she said, keeping her voice low and steady. I brought these from my home planet. Would you like to see them? No answer came, but those silver eyes locked onto the objects in her hands with laser focus. She could practically feel the intensity of his attention. Rachel started with the Rubik's Cube. She turned it slowly in her hands, letting the light catch the different colored squares. Red, blue, green, yellow, orange, white. She worked it methodically, narrating what she was doing in simple terms. Red pieces go with red. Blue corners here. Making a white cross pattern on this side. Her fingers moved with practiced ease, twisting the sections. 45 minutes later, she glanced up briefly. Kelvin had moved 3 feet closer. She bit back a smile and kept working. She finished solving the cube and set it down carefully. Then she picked up the wire ring puzzle, her fingers working the metal loops with patience. This puzzle was different from the cube. It required spatial thinking, the willingness to sometimes move pieces backward to eventually move forward. Tommy had loved these kinds of puzzles because they made sense in a way that people's emotions never did. Kelvin's head tilted to one side as he watched. His secondary set of arms unfolded slightly from his body, a sign he was relaxing just a little bit. By mid-afternoon, Kelvin sat right beside her. Still not touching, still maintaining careful distance, but close enough that Rachel could see the delicate patterns in his scales. They looked almost like fingerprints, unique and beautiful. She was working on the wooden burr puzzle when Kelvin's primary right hand slowly extended outward, hovering over the Rubik's Cube she'd solved earlier. Rachel froze her movements but kept her eyes focused on her own puzzle. She didn't want to spook him with direct attention. "You can pick it up," she said quietly, casually. "It's yours if you want it. I brought it for you." Kelvin's hand descended. His 4 fingers wrapped around the cube and he lifted it carefully. He turned it once, examining it, then twice. Then his fingers started moving, twisting the sections with surprising speed and precision. In less than 3 minutes, he'd solved what had taken Rachel 45 minutes. "You're brilliant," Rachel breathed, genuinely amazed. The response was immediate and stunning. Kelvin's scales rippled in a wave of color that traveled from his head down to his feet. Blue, purple, even flashes of gold. Pure joy. Then just as quickly the colors faded back to gray, like he'd remembered he wasn't supposed to feel things. But Rachel had seen it. The capacity for happiness was there, just buried under years of overwhelming sensory input and confusion about how to exist in a world that wasn't built for him. Over the next 10 days they built something together. Not friendship exactly, not yet, but understanding. A shared language. Rachel learned to read Kelvin's movements like a book. When he rocked back and forth, it meant his brain was processing something complex, working through problems at speed she couldn't imagine. When his scales went gray, he was overwhelmed and needed space. When they brightened with color, he was engaged and happy. She discovered he could tolerate her presence for 6 hours now, as long as she kept things predictable and gave him room to retreat when he needed it. She taught him games from Earth that involved taking turns. Simple things like tic-tac-toe and Connect 4, building the concept that interaction could be reciprocal, that communication was like passing a ball back and forth. She brought him music from different human cultures. Classical, jazz, folk songs from different countries. He seemed absolutely fascinated by Bach, and Rachel wasn't surprised. The mathematical precision of Bach's compositions spoke to something deep in Kelvin's neural architecture. And slowly, so slowly you could barely notice it happening, the distance between them shrank. By the 14th day, Kelvin would hand Rachel puzzle pieces directly. Their fingers never touched during the exchange, but the act itself required trust. He had to believe she wouldn't suddenly grab his hand, wouldn't violate the boundaries they'd established. By the 18th day, he sat close enough that his scales occasionally brushed against her sleeve. Contact through fabric, indirect and therefore manageable. High Chamberlain Sortek watched from the observation room during Rachel's break times. His scales had become a chaotic display of hope and fear mixed together. "The ceremony is in 12 days, he told Rachel during one of her brief visits to his office. Prince Kelvin must accept the crown from Emperor Vorthanes directly. Skin-to-skin contact on his head, sustained for a full 60 seconds while the knowledge transfer happens. Can you really prepare him for that?" "I honestly don't know," Rachel admitted, exhaustion clear in her voice. "We're making progress, building toward it step by step. But I can't make you any promises. His neurology is different from my brother's back home. Every autistic person is unique. I'm learning as I go, same as him." "The military situation is getting worse," Sortek said quietly, his voice heavy. "House Calvex has begun full mobilization of their fleet. They can smell weakness and they're preparing to strike." Rachel thought about the boy in that chamber. The brilliant, gentle mind trapped in a body that experienced every sensation as either too much or too little. "Tell me about Kelvin's interests," she said. "What does he actually care about? What makes him happy besides puzzles?" "Interests?" Sortek looked confused by the question. "Yes, interests. Hobbies. Things he does for fun. What does he enjoy?" "I don't understand the question. We've always focused on evaluating his successor competencies. Strategic thinking capabilities, political analysis skills, mathematical aptitude for running an empire." "He's 8 years old," Rachel said flatly, anger creeping into her voice. "What does he do for fun? What makes him laugh? What does he dream about?" Sortek's scales dimmed with what might have been shame. We never considered that he experienced fun. We thought he was incapable of such things. That night, Rachel came to Kelvin's chamber with something completely different. No puzzles, no games, no educational objectives. Just a small holographic projector she'd borrowed from the Palace Technology Department. She sat in their usual spot and activated it. A star field bloomed in the air between them, three-dimensional and breathtaking. Earth's night sky, exactly as it looked from her hometown, with all the constellations marked in soft, glowing lines. "This is where I come from," Rachel said softly, her voice full of warmth. "See that yellow star right there? The bright one? That's our sun. Third planet out, that's Earth. My home. It's mostly covered in water, which I know sounds weird. And these patterns connecting the stars, we call them constellations. They're stories written in the sky. Our ancestors looked up and saw pictures, created myths and legends." Kelvin stared at the projection with complete fascination. All four of his hands reached out toward the hologram, passing through the light projections of distant suns. His fingers moved through the starlight like he was trying to touch something 100 light-years away. And then, for the first time since Rachel had met him, Kelvin made a sound. Not words, but a soft, musical trill that rose and fell like laughter. Pure, unfiltered joy. "Do you want to see your homeworld from space?" Rachel asked gently. "Cor Vathis from orbit? I can program that in." Kelvin looked directly at her. 3 full seconds of eye contact, which was enormous for him. Then he spoke his third word to her since they'd met. "Yes." Rachel smiled and started reprogramming the projector, her fingers flying over the controls. And in the observation room high above, an entire empire held its breath and dared to hope. The star hologram became their special connection over the following days. Every evening, Rachel would project different worlds into the space between them. Earth's vast oceans that covered most of the planet. The rust-red canyons of Mars that stretched for hundreds of miles. The spectacular rings of Saturn that sparkled like cosmic jewelry. Kelvin would point with one of his 4 hands and narrate in his halting, careful standard galactic. He'd tell her about Valdris colonies on distant moons, about nebulas he'd studied in his educational programs, about the mathematical properties of orbital mechanics that went completely over Rachel's head but clearly fascinated him. But most importantly, he was talking. Actually engaging with another living being. Existing in a shared space with someone else and not just tolerating it but maybe even enjoying it. With 8 days left until the ceremony, Rachel knew they couldn't avoid the real issue any longer. She'd spent the previous night consulting with the Chamberlain, studying detailed files on Valdris neural physiology, and preparing herself for a difficult conversation. She had to be honest with Kelvin about what was coming, even if the truth was scary. "Kelvin," she said during their morning session, her voice gentle but serious, "I need to explain something to you about the bonding ceremony." His scales immediately dimmed to that flat gray. He'd heard those words before from other people, and he knew they always preceded something unpleasant, something that would hurt him. "You already know you have to accept the crown from your father," Rachel continued, keeping her tone steady and calm. "But I need you to really understand why this matters. Not just because of politics or tradition or keeping the empire together. I want you to understand what it actually means." She pulled up a hologram on her portable display, showing 2 Valdris figures in ceremonial robes. One figure placed an elaborate crown on the other's head, their hands maintaining contact throughout the process. "In human culture we have something kind of similar," Rachel explained. "When my father was very sick, right before he died, he put his hand on top of my head. Just like this." She demonstrated on herself, placing her palm on her own head. "It was his way of passing his knowledge to me. His love, his experiences, everything he'd learned in life. All of it given to me in one final gesture. It wasn't really about the physical touch itself. It was about the connection between us, parent to child." Kelvin watched the hologram, his silver eyes reflecting the soft light. He was listening intently, processing every word. "Your father wants to give you everything he knows," Rachel said softly. "All the wisdom he's gained from ruling an empire for decades. All the responsibility, yes, but also all the love he has for you. That's what the crown transfer really is. It's his way of saying you're ready, that he trusts you, that he believes in you. But for the transfer to work, he has to touch your head with both hands, and you have to maintain that connection for 60 full seconds while the knowledge flows from his mind to yours." 60 seconds is very long, Kelvin said quietly, and Rachel heard the fear in his voice. "It is," Rachel agreed honestly. "It's very long, especially for you. I won't lie to you and say it'll be easy because it won't be. But I think we can practice together. We can build up to it gradually. If you're willing to try, that is. You always have a choice. Kelvin rocked back and forth for a full minute, his body moving in that precise rhythm while his mind worked through the problem. Rachel waited patiently, giving him all the time he needed. Finally, he stopped rocking and looked at her. "Show me how," he said. Rachel's heart leaped with hope and pride. "Okay. We'll start very small and work our way up slowly. See this." She held up a soft piece of cloth, smooth silk that wouldn't irritate sensitive skin. "First, we practice with fabric between us. No skin touching skin directly. Just getting used to the basic idea of contact." She placed the cloth on her own open palm, demonstrating. "Your turn, but only if you want to. You can stop any time." Kelvin stared at the cloth on her palm for 3 full minutes. Rachel could see his scales flickering through colors rapidly, his brain running calculations, weighing risks, preparing himself. Then, moving so slowly it was almost painful to watch, he extended his primary right hand forward. His 4 fingers trembled slightly as they descended and finally made contact with the cloth covering Rachel's palm. Through the fabric barrier, Rachel could feel the tremor running through his entire hand. She could see his scales flickering wildly through colors. Gray, blue, gray, purple, back to gray again. His nervous system was being overwhelmed by even this indirect contact. 5 seconds, Rachel said gently when he pulled away, gasping slightly. "You did it for 5 whole seconds. That's absolutely perfect for a first try." They practiced for an hour. By the end of the session, Kelvin could maintain the fabric touch for 20 seconds before pulling away, his scales flashing white with sensory overload. But he'd done it. 20 seconds was enormous progress. Over the next 3 days they built tolerance gradually. Rachel brought different fabrics for him to experience. Smooth silk that barely registered. Soft cotton that was slightly more textured. Synthetic weaves that felt different from natural materials. They practiced different pressure levels too. Feather-light touches that barely made contact. Gentle pressure that was more noticeable. Sustained contact where the touch didn't go away after a second. Kelvin's ability grew with each session, but Rachel could see what it cost him. After every practice, he'd retreat to his corner and rock for hours, sometimes making soft sounds of distress as his brain processed the overwhelming input. She wanted to comfort him, but she knew the best thing she could do was give him space to recover in his own way. With 5 days remaining until the ceremony, Rachel introduced the next phase of their training. Her hand near his, hovering in the air without actually touching. Just proximity, just presence. Learning that another person being close didn't always mean contact was coming. "My brother Tommy used to do this with our cat back home," Rachel explained, holding her hand a few inches from Kelvin's. He couldn't pet the cat directly because the sensation was too much for his nervous system. Too much sensory input all at once. But he could sit near her with his hand close by. Eventually, our cat would lean into his hand on her own terms. She initiated the contact so Tommy could prepare himself mentally. It gave him control. "I am not a cat," Kelvin said, and Rachel burst out laughing. She couldn't help it. He'd made a joke. An actual joke. His scales rippled with gold for 3 full seconds before fading, and Rachel felt tears of joy pricking her eyes. That afternoon, with their hands hovering just an inch apart in the air, Kelvin asked the question Rachel had been dreading. "What happens if I cannot do it? The ceremony?" Rachel considered lying for a moment. Considered offering false reassurance that everything would definitely work out fine. But Kelvin deserved the truth. He was brilliant and perceptive, and he'd know if she was lying anyway. "Then your empire might collapse into civil war," she said quietly, meeting his eyes. "A lot of people might die fighting each other. Your father's legacy might end. The peace he's maintained for decades could shatter. But Kelvin, and this is really important, that would not be your fault. Do you understand me? You didn't choose to have a nervous system that processes touch differently than other Valdris. You didn't choose your neurology any more than I chose to be human. If the empire is so fragile that one 8-year-old sensory processing differences can destroy it, then maybe the empire needs to change, not you." "But people will die," Kelvin said, his voice very small. "Maybe," Rachel acknowledged. "Or maybe something else will happen. Maybe seeing their prince struggle with something difficult and overcome it will teach them more about real leadership than any ceremony ever could. Maybe they'll learn that strength isn't just about wielding power over others. Maybe they'll learn that true courage means facing the things that terrify you most, even when every instinct screams at you to run away." Kelvin's 4 hands curled into tight fists. His scales had gone almost completely gray. "I do not want people to die because I am broken." "You are not broken," Rachel said fiercely, with more emotion than she'd shown in weeks. Listen to me, Kelvin. You are not broken. You're different. Your brain processes the world in a unique way, and that is not a flaw or a mistake. It's just reality. What we're doing here isn't fixing you like you're some kind of machine that malfunctioned. We're building a bridge between your way of experiencing the world and your father's way. That's all. Kelvin was silent for a long moment, his whole body perfectly still. Then his primary right hand moved, closing that final inch of distance between them. His skin touched Rachel's hand directly for the first time ever. Skin to skin. No barriers. 3 seconds passed. Then 5. Then 10. Rachel felt the tremor running through his entire body, felt how much effort this cost him. But she held perfectly still, barely breathing, letting him maintain complete control of the contact. He could pull away whenever he needed to. 15 seconds. 20. Enough, Kelvin gasped, yanking his hand back. His scales had gone pure white, completely washed out. Total sensory overload. He wrapped all 4 arms around himself and began rocking frantically. But he had done it. He had touched another living being voluntarily and survived. 20 seconds of direct contact. In the observation room high above, High Chamberlain Sortek wept openly, his scales flashing through colors that meant hope and grief and pride all mixed together. 5 days until the ceremony. 20 seconds achieved. They needed 60. Might just be enough. Had to be enough. The alternative was unthinkable. With only 3 days left until the ceremony, Rachel received a message she hadn't expected. Not a summons to the observation room or another meeting with the Chamberlain. This was different. A formal invitation to the Emperor's private quarters. Emperor Vorthanes himself wanted to speak with her directly. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she walked through the palace corridors. She'd seen the Emperor in videos and official recordings, but never in person. Guards escorted her through hallways decorated with artwork from a dozen different worlds, past windows that looked out over the glittering capital city below. Finally they reached a simple door. Not grand or imposing, just a door. It opened quietly. Emperor Vorthanes was much smaller than Rachel had imagined. Valdris males were supposed to grow larger as they aged, reaching impressive sizes after decades of life. But illness had withered the Emperor down to something fragile. His scales still bore the deep purple and gold of ancient royalty, but they flickered weakly like a candle about to go out. Beneath his ceremonial robes, Rachel could see the tremor of failing organs, the slight shake that meant his body was shutting down. Sit, please. The Emperor gestured to a cushioned seat with one of his hands. His secondary arms hung limp at his sides. My son and I have very little time left for formality and protocol. Rachel sat carefully, noting details. The paralysis was spreading faster than the medical briefings had indicated. Vorthanes was dying more quickly than anyone had admitted publicly. You have accomplished something remarkable, Vorthanes said, his voice surprisingly strong despite his physical weakness. In 3 weeks you've done more than my entire court managed in 8 years. Kelvin speaks now. He engages with another person. Yesterday the monitoring systems recorded him humming one of your Earth songs. Do you understand what a miracle that is? Do you comprehend how impossible that seemed just a month ago? With respect, Your Majesty, Rachel said carefully, I didn't really do anything special. I just gave him space to be himself. I treated him like a person instead of a problem that needed solving. Precisely, the Emperor said, and his scales brightened briefly with emotion. You treated him as a person. Not as a malfunctioning successor unit. Not as a political liability. Not as a source of shame. Just as a child who needed understanding. A person. The weight of guilt in those words was almost physical. Rachel could hear 8 years of regret compressed into that single statement. I am dying, Vorthanes continued with blunt honesty. The neural decay is accelerating faster than my doctors predicted. If I do not transfer the crown of minds within 3 days, the knowledge dies with me forever. 12 generations of emperors, all the collective wisdom encoded in our family's genetic memory gone. Lost. And Kelvin will inherit an empire with 17 noble houses ready to tear each other apart. He can do it, Rachel said, though uncertainty gnawed at her insides like acid. We've been practicing every day. He's making real progress. I have watched your training sessions, Vorthanes said quietly. 20 seconds of direct contact is remarkable, truly remarkable. But Rachel, the ceremony requires 60 seconds of sustained touch. 60 seconds while I transfer the crown. And it is not gentle contact. The crown must be pressed firmly onto his head. My hands must maintain constant, heavy pressure on either side of his skull while the neural transfer occurs. For a child who experiences ordinary touch as pain, this will be torture, Rachel finished, the word bitter in her mouth. Yes. The Emperor's scales dimmed to near black. I will torture my own son to save my empire. I will cause him agony to preserve a dynasty. What does that make me, human Rachel? What kind of father does that make me? Rachel thought about Kelvin. Brave, brilliant Kelvin, who was forcing himself to endure physical contact that hurt him because adults had decided it was necessary. Because politics and tradition and imperial succession mattered more than his comfort. It makes you a father trapped in an impossible situation, she said finally. It makes you human even though you're not. I requested this meeting because I need to understand something, Vorthani said, leaning forward with intensity in his silver eyes. Can my son truly bear this experience? Or am I about to destroy him psychologically to preserve a dynasty that might not deserve to continue? Rachel met the Emperor's gaze directly. Honesty seemed like the only option. The truth? I genuinely don't know. We've built up to 20 seconds and that nearly overwhelms his entire system. Tripling that duration with much more intense contact, plus the added neural load of the crown transfer pouring knowledge into his brain? It's going to push him beyond anything we've practiced. It might break something inside him that can't be repaired. Then I should cancel the ceremony, Vorthani said quickly. Find another way. There must be alternatives. There is no other way, is there? Rachel interrupted. I've read the files. The genetic encoding is specific to your direct bloodline. The knowledge transfer can only happen during the ceremony from father to heir. It works or it doesn't. Those are the only two options. Vorthani's silence was all the confirmation Rachel needed. Then the real question isn't whether Kelvin can do it comfortably, Rachel continued. The question is whether he can survive it at all. And whether surviving it will damage him permanently. Whether we'll save the empire but destroy the boy in the process. You are his advocate, the Emperor said. His protector. What do you counsel? What should I do? Rachel thought about her brother Tommy. All the time she'd had to balance his needs against a world that refused to accommodate him. All the time she'd had to decide whether pushing him outside his comfort zone would help him grow or just cause trauma. I counsel that you ask Kelvin directly, she said. Explain exactly what will happen during the ceremony. Don't sugarcoat it or hide the truth. Tell him what it will cost him physically and emotionally. Then let him choose. He's supposed to be the heir to an empire. He should get to decide if he actually wants that future, that responsibility. The next day, Rachel brought Kelvin to his father's quarters. It was the first time father and son had been in the same room in 6 years. 6 entire years of separation. Kelvin's scales went gray the instant he entered, his entire body tensing up. His 4 arms wrapped tight around his torso in a protective gesture. But he didn't run. He didn't retreat. He stayed. Hello, son, Vorthani said softly, his voice gentle. Do you remember me at all? Father Emperor, Kelvin responded, his voice formal and distant. Genetic progenitor. Supreme Commander of the Valdris forces. I have studied your speeches extensively. Your military strategies. Your trade negotiations with the outer colonies. But do you know me? Vorthani's asked, and his voice cracked with emotion. Not as emperor, not as a political figure. As your father? As the person who should have been there for you? Kelvin tilted his head, genuinely confused by the question. The concept seemed foreign to him. Rachel stepped forward carefully. Your father wants to know if you understand that he loves you. Not because you're his heir or because of duty. He loves you because you're his child. His son. The Emperor's scales flushed with powerful emotion. Colors swirled across his body. I have been a terrible father, Vorthani said, his voice breaking. I let my court treat you like a problem to be solved. I should have spent time with you. I should have learned about your world, tried to understand how you experience things. But I was afraid, Kelvin. So afraid that my presence would hurt you. That my touch would cause you pain. So I stayed away. I told myself I was being kind, but really I was just a coward. Kelvin processed this information for a long moment, his scales flickering through colors. Fear is logical, he said finally. Your contact would have caused me significant pain. Staying away was kind. It protected me. It was cowardly, Vorthani's countered firmly. And now I must ask you to endure pain for the Empire. Rachel says we should let you choose your own path. So I am asking directly, will you accept the crown of mines? Will you let me pass our ancestors' wisdom to you, even though it means 60 seconds of contact you are not ready for? Even though it will hurt. Kelvin looked at Rachel. She nodded encouragingly but remained silent. This decision had to be entirely his own. If I refuse, Kelvin said slowly, working through the logic, the Empire falls into war. Many people die. Worlds burn. If I accept, I will experience significant pain, but I will gain the knowledge necessary to rule. To prevent war and death. Yes, Vorthanis confirmed. That is the choice. Kelvin's scales flickered through rapid color changes, his mind processing variables and outcomes at impossible speeds. Finally, they settled on a determined blue-purple that Rachel had never seen before. I choose the crown, Kelvin said clearly. I will endure the pain. For the Empire. For the people. But Father, after the ceremony ends, I will need 3 days completely alone to recover. No visitors. No obligations. 3 days, Vorthanis agreed, his voice thick with pride and grief mixed together. You have my solemn word. Rachel watched father and son, separated by 6 feet of empty space and 8 years of misunderstanding, and she sent a silent prayer to whatever gods might listen. Please let this not break him. Please let him survive this intact. The bonding ceremony was held in the Hall of Ancestors, a massive chamber with a dome ceiling that displayed the actual sky above Cor Vathis Prime in real time. Stars glittered overhead like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Representatives from all 17 noble houses filled the hall, their scales displaying every color imaginable. Skepticism, anticipation, curiosity, contempt. They'd heard rumors about the prince's progress, but rumors were just words. They needed to see with their own eyes. Rachel stood in the small preparation chamber with Kelvin, who was vibrating like a plucked guitar string. His scales flickered between colors so rapidly they appeared almost white, cycling through his entire emotional spectrum in seconds. Fear, determination, panic, resolve, all of it flashing across his body faster than Rachel could track. I cannot do this, he whispered, his voice barely audible. There are too many people out there. Too much light. Too much noise. Too many eyes watching me. Too much everything. Hey! Rachel knelt down to his eye level, being careful not to touch him. Remember our breathing pattern? The one we practiced? They breathed together in perfect sync. 4 counts breathing in slowly. Hold for 7 counts. 8 counts breathing out. It was a technique her brother had taught her years ago, something that had helped him through countless panic attacks. She taught it to Kelvin and now they used it as their anchor. You can do this, Rachel said firmly, putting all her confidence into those words. And I'll be right there in the front row. If you need to stop, if it becomes too much, just look at me. Look directly at me and I'll figure something out. I promise. Okay. What could you possibly do? Kelvin asked, a hint of bitter humor in his voice. You are human. You have no power here. No authority. No influence. Rachel smiled grimly. I've gotten surprisingly good at causing diplomatic incidents over the past 3 weeks. Your Chamberlain is terrified of me now. So trust me, if you need me to stop this ceremony, I'll find a way. Now come on. Your empire is waiting out there, and you're going to show them what real courage looks like. The hall fell into absolute silence as Kelvin entered. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every head turned. He walked with rigid precision, his 4 arms held stiffly at his sides, his movements mechanical. The crowd murmured among themselves. This was their first actual look at the prince in years. Many of them had never seen him at all. Some whispered that he looked weak. Others noted his strange gait with disapproval. Emperor Vorthanis stood at the center of the raised platform, looking small and frail under the vast dome of stars. Beside him, the crown of mines hovered inside an ornate stasis field, glowing with soft inner light. The artifact looked ancient and powerful, a crystalline circlet that would transfer 12 generations of imperial knowledge directly into Kelvin's neural pathways. 12 emperors, all their wisdom, all their memories, all condensed into 60 seconds of contact. Approach, my heir, Vorthanis called out, his voice amplified to reach every corner of the massive hall. Kelvin walked forward. Rachel counted each step from her seat in the front row. 20 steps. 30. 40. She could see how his scales dimmed with each footfall, how his body grew more rigid as he got closer to his father. He reached the platform. Climbed the 3 steps. Stood before the emperor. Kelvin, Prince of Valdris, heir to the eternal throne, Vorthanis spoke the ancient ritual words. Do you accept the burden and blessing of the crown of mines? Do you accept the wisdom of your ancestors and the responsibility to lead? I do. Kelvin's voice was so quiet it barely carried past the first row. Vorthanis reached toward the crown with trembling hands. The stasis field deactivated with a soft hum, and he lifted the artifact carefully. It seemed almost too heavy for his weakened arms. The crowd leaned forward collectively. This was the moment. Everything came down to this. The Emperor began lowering the crown toward his son's head. The instant the crystalline artifact touched Kelvin's scales, the boy's entire body went rigid. Every muscle locked. Vorthanis's hands settled on either side of the crown, one hand on each side of Kelvin's head, maintaining the firm contact necessary for the neural transfer to begin. The crowd held its breath. 60 seconds. They needed 60 seconds. 5 seconds passed. Kelvin's scales blazed white-gray, his whole body shaking violently. Rachel could see the effort it took for him just to remain standing. 10 seconds. His mouth opened in a silent scream. No sound came out, but the agony was written across every inch of his body. 15 seconds. Rachel saw his knees buckle slightly. The transfer had begun. Behind Kelvin's silver eyes, data was streaming. Memories, knowledge, 12 lifetimes of information pouring into an 8-year-old mind. 20 seconds. The longest they'd ever managed in practice. They were in uncharted territory now. 25 seconds. Kelvin's scales started flickering toward black, that terrifying shade that meant neural shutdown. His body's emergency defense mechanism against overwhelming sensory input. Rachel stood up, ready to run onto that platform and damn the consequences. But then Kelvin's eyes found hers across the crowded hall. She did the only thing she could think of. She began to hum. That Bach piece Kelvin loved, the mathematical progression that spoke to something deep in his unique mind. The melody that had become their bridge. 30 seconds. Kelvin's scales lightened just slightly. Still shaking, still clearly drowning in agony, but holding on. Holding on because Rachel was there, because he wasn't alone. 35 seconds. The other humans in the crowd recognized the tune. The small Earth delegation that had come to witness the ceremony. They joined Rachel's humming, their voices blending together. 40 seconds. The sound built and swelled, a mathematical harmony filling the hall. Kelvin's scales began showing colors again. Not healthy colors, not normal colors, but no longer that death-black shade. 45 seconds. Rachel could see Emperor Vorthani struggling too. The neural transfer was draining his already failing body. Father and son, both suffering together, both enduring the unbearable. 50 seconds. The crown blazed with brilliant light. The transfer was almost complete. 12 generations of knowledge, 12 emperors' worth of wisdom, all of it flooding into one small child's mind. 55 seconds. Kelvin's body began collapsing, his legs giving out. Vorthani's held firm, his hands pressing the crown to his son's head, the only thing keeping the boy upright. 60 seconds. The crown's light died suddenly, like a candle being snuffed out. Vorthani's released his grip and caught Kelvin as the boy fell completely, lowering him gently to the platform floor. His hands shook with the effort. The hall erupted into absolute chaos. Some nobles were cheering wildly, celebrating the successful transfer. Others were protesting loudly, claiming the ceremony had been invalid somehow. Still others just stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they'd witnessed. Rachel was already running. Her feet pounded against the floor as she sprinted toward the platform. She reached it just as Valdris physicians in white robes converged from all sides. "Give him space," Rachel commanded with an authority that shocked even her. "Everyone step back. He needs quiet right now. Dim these lights immediately. Clear this hall. Everyone out. Now." To her amazement, High Chamberlain Sortek began issuing orders that matched hers exactly. Guards moved to usher the crowd out. The dome lights dimmed to barely a glow. Within minutes, the hall was nearly empty and quiet. In the soft dimness, Kelvin stirred. His eyes opened slowly and Rachel saw something completely new there. A depth, an ancient awareness that hadn't existed before. 12 generations of emperors looked out through a child's silver eyes. It was unsettling and beautiful at the same time. "Did I succeed?" His voice cracked with exhaustion. "You did it," Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face. 60 full seconds. "You saved the entire empire, Kelvin. You saved everyone." Kelvin's scales rippled through every single color in the Valdris spectrum. Joy and pain and triumph and exhaustion, all mixed together in waves across his body. "Father?" he asked weakly. Vorthanis knelt beside his son with effort. For the first time in 6 years he deliberately reached out and touched Kelvin. Just a hand on the shoulder. Brief and gentle, lasting only a moment. "I am so proud of you," the Emperor said, his voice thick with emotion. "So incredibly proud." "That hurts," Kelvin admitted honestly. But he didn't pull away immediately. He endured it for 3 full seconds before both father and son released each other, both respecting each other's limits and boundaries. 3 days later, exactly as promised, Rachel found Kelvin in his chamber. He'd spent those days alone recovering. Now he was well enough to sit up, working on an Earth puzzle she'd left for him. "The noble houses have withdrawn their military fleets," he said without looking up from the puzzle. "The empire is stable. War has been averted. My father says I will officially take the throne when I reach maturity at 15 standard years. 7 more years to prepare." "How are you feeling?" Rachel asked, sitting in her usual spot. "Different," Kelvin said, setting down the puzzle carefully. "I have 12 generations of memories in my head now. It is overwhelming. Like having 12 different voices all talking at once. But it is useful. I understand so much more about politics, strategy, history. And I understand something else too, something important." "What's that?" "Why you helped me." Kelvin's scales showed a soft blue that meant gratitude and affection. "You did not do it for the empire or to prevent war or for any grand political reason. You helped me because I was a child who needed someone to see him as a person. Like your brother Tommy needed you to see him." Rachel's eyes burned with tears. "Yeah. I guess that's exactly right." "I will need you to stay here," Kelvin said seriously. "When I become emperor in 7 years, I will need someone who treats me like a person and not just a title. Someone who understands that being different is not the same as being broken. Will you stay?" "I'm not nearly diplomatic enough to be an imperial advisor," Rachel laughed through her tears. "No," Kelvin agreed with a hint of humor. "But you are exactly diplomatic enough to be my friend. So will you stay?" Rachel thought about Earth, about the life she'd left behind. Then she looked at this brilliant, brave child who'd endured torture to save billions of lives. Who'd let himself be touched despite terror. Who'd hummed Bach while empires watched and judged. "Yeah," she said softly. "I'll stay. Someone has to make sure you remember to dim those awful lights and turn off that terrible humming noise." Kelvin's scales flashed pure gold. Laughter. Joy. Hope. And somewhere in the palace, Emperor Vorthanes rested easier, knowing his son would have at least one person who loved him not for his title or his power, but simply for being himself. The human had calmed the emperor's heir. But more than that, she taught an entire empire that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from power, but from the courage to be vulnerable. And sometimes the gentlest touch can change the course of stars.